Welcome to the Jerry Powell Podcast. This is Eric Widera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, we have somebody else in our room with us today.
We have Jules, who's going to say his last name for us.
Hey, this is Jules Vio.
Who is a palliative care fellow here at UCSF. Welcome to the Jerry Powell Podcast, Jules.
Thanks for having me.
And I see somebody right on my little video screen here calling in from Chicago.
Yes, we have joining us on the Skype line, Lew Cohen, who is the author of a book, A Dignified Ending, Taking Control Over How We Die. Lew is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Massachusetts and a palliative medicine researcher who has been involved in palliative care for a long time. Welcome to the Jerry Powell Podcast, Lew.
Well, thank you. I've been a longtime fan from my computer.
Well, we are really excited to talk to you about your new book, A Dignified Ending, talking a lot about physician-assisted suicide, aid in dying. We'll talk about the terminology used, but before we dive into that, we always start off with a song request. You got a song for Alex?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, You Are My Sunshine.
Wonderful.
You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. The other night, dear, as I lay sleeping, I dreamed I held you in my arms. When I awoke, dear, I was mistaken, and I hung my head down and cried. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when the skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away.
Thank you, guys.
I would love to know why you picked that song.
Well, I could start by saying it's because it means something to Jules. And Jules, you could tell us, and then I'll give you a little bit actually from the book where it comes from. But Jules?
I'll make sure my son Anders hears that I used to sing that to him when he was a young man.
The song, although it doesn't seem to, immediately resonate with us as being related to end of life, figured in the book in the following way. The book consists of a series of stories that are interwoven with each other, and pretty much the last two have to do with a woman named Cody Curtis and her oncologist, Kate Morris, who were in Oregon and who made use of the law that they've had there now for some 22 years. The other story that's interwoven in that piece of the book is that of Brittany Menard, who is much better known, the 29-year-old woman who had a glioblastoma and who moved to Oregon so she could take advantage of the law, and whose last few weeks and the videos and such have really given a boost to the Right to Die movement. But to get back to Cody Curtis, she was given an opportunity to be filmed in the documentary that won one of the awards at that time.
How to Die in Oregon, right?
How to Die in Oregon, yeah.
Reading through your book, I was just amazed at the different stories that you present. I think this one is an example of also how when everything also goes right and beautifully. And I liked also how you presented a lot of different stories. I'd like to talk about that, but before we do, can we just take a step back and just, how did you get interested in this as a subject? Because, previously from a palliative care perspective, you've done a lot of kind of work in kidney disease and palliative care and the intersection between those two. How did this come into play?
Yeah, my main research had been related to how people come to stop dialysis and to die. And I wrote a book right before this one in which it was prompted by the fact that two of the nurses, our renal nurses, had been accused of basically murdering one of our patients, and it was an instance in which the patient had stopped dialysis while being in the hospital, and it turned into this horrible thing where the police were contacted and an investigation was done. Bottom line, what I wrote about in the book called "No Good Deed" was about how there's a certain percentage of palliative medicine physicians and clinicians who get accused of having killed their patients. And so I tried to make sense of what was going on. And then after the book came out, I was invited to join a think tank about assisted dying. And as I did that, and I got to meet the physician who had organized the think tank, a man named Martin Raff, First of all, I learned that Martin himself naturally had a very personal story to tell, which had to do with his parents, both of whom, with the full support of Martin and his brother, another physician, had decided at a certain point, they were quite elderly, that it was time for them to die, and had taken an overdose. And I came out of it, out of this conference that Martin set up, just really curious about these folk who make such decisions. I came out thinking that, to my eyes, there isn't a lot of difference between what they do and what the families and the patients who stop dialysis and hasten their deaths are doing. And while I appreciate, needless to say, the differences that we all sort of drum up, I was more struck by the similarities. And so I was off to the races, trying to make further sense of the more active deaths involving assisted suicide or assisted dying. And this book came out 7 years later.
And in this book, a lot of great stories. I am impressed that you start off with, I believe, Hercules. Hercules? Hercules. Yeah. We go on to other examples of contemporary people who've taken their lives, but you also bring in people like Sigmund Freud, who I had no idea actually, with the aid of his physician, ended his life. And just some of those stories really just were eye-opening for me. I mean, Sigmund Freud, who knew?
And I can tell you, I've presented about Sigmund Freud's terminal illness and his death. And the death involved him having a relationship with a personal physician that from the beginning had stated that when things got too bad and he wasn't able to go any further, he wanted the physician's help. And that physician, at a certain point, injected morphine into Freud, put him into coma, and he died. But I presented this to, on one occasion, 1,000 different psychiatrists who were in the office, who were in the audience. And like you, for many of us, this was the first time we had ever heard such a thing. Yeah.
Can we talk about terminology here? I mean, what ought we call this? And what are the sort of the different terms used, and what are the different positions by those who espouse that we should say this term, use this term versus that term?
Yeah. I mean, needless to say, words are important. Names for things, names for practices are important. What I chose to do in this book was to use all the names that I encountered. So, assisted suicide, I mentioned a moment ago, is the favorite term actually of people who oppose such deaths. Assisted dying more commonly is used by supporters. Medical aid in dying or medical assistance in dying is the term that's used in Canada, which I like. And there really are just, kind of a host of others. And people are, pretty vigorous in their defense of using particular terms and not using others. I'm cool about using them all.
Yeah, and in particular in your book, you said that you're actually okay with the use of the word suicide. Can you describe that?
Sure. I mean, again, my background's in psychiatry, and I'm a psychiatric consultant who has probably interviewed some, 500, I would say, per year folk who come in with suicide attempts. So it's a term that, I use absolutely all the time. And the way I think about it now, especially after the 7 years of working on this book, is that there's a whole bunch of different kinds of suicides. There are some that we can and should do absolutely everything to prevent them from happening. And then there's others that we should be accorded our respect and our help. I mean, how about you guys? I presume you have some thoughts on this.
Alex, my own thought is I don't like death with dignity because it doesn't actually describe what's going on, and it feels very like it feels like spin, like you're trying to push. I like medical aid in dying, like it actually conveys to me a message of what's going on without trying to argue too much for a kind of a pro or against stance on what we were doing.
Yeah, I suppose I generally, putting my nickel down, where do I stand on this issue? I'm deeply ambivalent.
You're like most guidelines.
Most guidelines
you have
are deeply ambivalent. And I think my
studied neutrality.
Studied
Alex
neutrality. That's right. That's where I am. And that's the AHPM official position, right? Right? Studied neutrality.
It is now. Years and years of clear-cut opposition, up and down the line in medical societies.
Mm-hmm. And I'm somebody who's like my parents were fierce advocates for aid in dying. They had Tim Quill at their house for a book signing. We interviewed Tim Quill a few podcasts ago. And my dad died of a glioblastoma multiforme. He ended up dying of an accident toward the end of his life, but they were fierce proponents even as my dad was terminally ill. But I worry about extending. I worry that the focus on aid in dying detracts, particularly coming from palliative medicine physicians, from where the focus should be on access to high-quality hospice and palliative care. And that in my daily practice, this is not as big of an issue as it is, lack of adequate support for people to meet their primary goal, which is, for most people to meet their primary goal, which is to die, at home, surrounded by loved ones. We have several patients on our service now, Jules and I are on service, who cannot return home where they want to be because there is no support system in our country to meet their needs in their home environments. And so for me, it's a matter of priorities, and that this these requests typically come from most privileged groups, well-off, wealthy, white individuals. And we should be cautious and skeptical of making laws that benefit those who are most privileged in our society. So at the same time, can I say that there is never a time where I would think this is appropriate for a patient? No, I can't do that. Yes, I'm deeply ambivalent. And so my preferred terminology from my perspective is I am also comfortable with multiple terms. I feel that the aid in dying is accurate insofar that these people are dying. If the term is broadened beyond people who are have a short prognosis, then that term should be changed to suicide.
And we had a previous podcast on the concept of rational suicide too, of individuals who may be older, don't have any psychological or end of life issues, but are still considering this. We'll have that link to that episode in our podcast notes. But you also talk about kind of the concept of rational suicide, Lew.
Yeah, the first stories that I tell in this book, and they reflect the first ones that I encountered, were stories told to me by family members. And oddly enough, both the story that Martin Reff, and I interviewed his brother as well, told me involved both parents. So one could call it a double suicide. I was interested in, I encountered Chester Nimitz Jr.'s family. And Chester Nimitz may be a name that's familiar to many of you guys as being an admiral during World War II. This was his son, who was also an admiral in that same war. And again, what the Nimitz family told me about was a joint suicide, a dual suicide, husband and wife. I was and continue to be incredibly impressed by the rationality of these people who made these difficult decisions. I would want to pick up on something that was just said before, which was sort of the priority kind of argument. And I know we want to sort of mix things up in this podcast because, among other things, it'll be more interesting. But let me challenge that we shouldn't be having these laws or putting this much attention on this issue while, frankly, people don't have good palliative care, don't have good lives with some basic things that one would want. I think that that's an argument that may be emotionally appealing, but the data doesn't really back it up, which is to say, why can't we both focus on this issue and also focus on these other things? It's not like one is going to push the other one away. And if you look at the states that have passed the laws, particularly the beginning ones like Oregon and Washington State, their palliative care services have not suffered as a result of it. And if anything, have gotten stronger and are among the best that we have in the country. And whenever you do pass a law like this, everyone who's going to be participating from the physician end wants to make damn sure that their patients have gotten maximal care, and that means sensitive attention to the palliative care issues. And so there really is some incentive, if you will, built into these laws where palliative care is only going to get better.
And I think you mentioned, too, that the vast majority of people who actually use physician aid in dying is that they are also use hospice and palliative care services. Is that right?
Yeah, you bet. You're talking 90, 95%. And it's for that same, it's that same reason their physicians really go out of their way to make sure that these folk are receiving good palliative care.
Yeah, so I actually just looked up the data from California, which passed the California End of Life Option Act recently, and for 2017, 374 individuals used the act. About 10% were under 60 years of age. The majority, 77%, were age 60 to 89, with the remainder over 90 years of age. The median age was 74. At the time of death, 90% were white, 51% female, 83% were receiving home hospice and or palliative care, and 73% had at least some level of college education.
Makes sense. And California, by the way, is, when it passed its laws, I think it's about 4 years now ago, that was an amazing opportunity for us to sort of see what happens when you have a pretty diverse population now able to tap into a law like this. Because Oregon, Washington, quite frankly, are not diverse. They don't have the diverse populations. California is the epitome of it. And you were right when you brought up the fact that the folk who are taking advantage, even in a culturally, ethnically diverse state like California, are predominantly white and are relatively well-to-do and are highly educated. There's no question about it. I think it's one of the challenges for laws like this to make themselves available to everybody and not just an elite group of patients. But let me just underscore what you've just sort of spelled out is it's a geriatric population, by and large, we're talking about.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking about the multiple barriers to access too, is that this is a really complicated process. Not many providers actually in California partake in the process. Some institutions say that nobody can partake in the process. If you're in a federal institution, you can't. And then you have medications where a dose of secobarbital is like $6,000. So there's financial barriers too, in addition to the multiple steps, including finding 2 different physicians to help you through the process.
Yeah.
And we've had a podcast with Bernie Lowe about dilemmas that physicians face as they're considering whether to participate or not. I wonder, Lew, did you want to respond to that? Because I wanted to segue into talking about broadening inclusion measures, if we could go there.
Sure. I'll just toss out the other factor that I know we will have to talk about is religion.
Tell me more.
Well, because those who are especially observant will, of course, naturally turn to their spiritual religious leaders, their churches, their synagogues for guidance as to whether or not such laws are ethical, are moral, and what they should do about them. And when these bills have been put forward, when they've been voted upon, when there's been a ballot question, and you sort of size up who's supporting them, who's opposing them, the most well-funded opposition is coming from the Catholic Church, which has ruled in lately fairly clearly that they are, again, opposed to this and feel that these are immoral laws that they will do their best to prevent from being put into place.
So, one of my concerns, getting back to this issue of decoupling palliative care and hospice and the best possible attention to symptoms and suffering from aid in dying, is that they are frequently basketed together, and that when that happens, toxic things happen to palliative care, and they're the unintended consequences of them being packaged together has the potential to lead to more suffering or lack of access or lack of expansion or changes in healthcare laws. The analogy here would be to the death panels and how, all legislation related to hospice and palliative care became toxic on Capitol Hill. Linkage of physician aid in dying to POLST forms or advanced care planning measures. And so I worry that while, yes, conceptually we should be able to decouple them, they are often packaged together in ways that have the potential to harm the underlying mission of hospice and palliative medicine.
So you're saying we shouldn't be, in palliative care, should not be closely associated with this, potentially.
That's
because the
my
optics.
position, yes. Though we do podcasts on this like every 3 months.
Yeah, this is every other podcast. We're going to do physician-aided dying.
But are you also saying, and let me just challenge a little bit, that we should decouple death and dying from palliative care and hospice?
Ooh, we have a blog post about that too. Should we change the name of AAHPM to
Puppies and kittens?
should we take the hospice out? This is I think this is clearly a wedge issue in the palliative care community, and that's important to notice. And rather than focusing on an issue which so clearly divides us, and as you write so eloquently in your book, just brings in people's emotions and activates the limbic system like no other issue in our field. Why not focus on areas in which we agree and where we have there's a huge amount of progress that needs to be done, and there are a huge amount of unmet needs.
I'll tell you why we shouldn't just go with the things that aren't emotionally evocative, or put it differently, why we should focus on something like this. And it's my own history on this subject is that when I sat down in that first conference that Martin Raff had set up, my own position at that time was we shouldn't have laws. That, hell, from time immemorial, physicians have extended to their fondest, favorite patients a service at the end, which is when the patients were suffering, that they would put them out of their misery, that they would give them an injection or find some way to help them to die. I thought initially, why should we have any laws? And then when I began to actually hear the stories that the Raffs told about their parents, or the Nimitzes told about their parents, or others that I mentioned, I realized that we need laws because just like my book, No Good Deed, there are plenty of folk who take offense at this, who feel that it is not only immoral but is illegal. And the next thing you know, law enforcement is involved, and that there are these risks and consequences if we don't address them with laws that are nice and clear and open up things. Then there are families that are going to be at risk and suffer, and there are physicians who will, in fact, want no part of helping their patients at the end because it's too dangerous. And they have enough going on that they don't want to do that, which is to say, I think we absolutely need to focus on this as a profession. I think that palliative care and hospice would be neglectful if they didn't tackle this and people didn't sort out their own feelings about it.
Now, I'm going to turn up the controversy dial just up from 9 to 11 on this 10-point dial. And I think, like you said in your book, like overall, the viewpoints on physician-aided dying is actually changing amongst physician and the general public as well.
Yep.
The number one thing that I hear, like when I've given talks about this subject before to like the general public is, oh yeah, if I had dementia, I certainly would want this. We need to like pass this law in California. And then I had to remind them, well, this law doesn't apply if you have a neurocognitive disorder like dementia, because you wouldn't have the capacity to make that decision if you were within 6 months of dying. So it doesn't apply to dementia patients. A good portion of your book and of your stories is around this particular issue, which is much more controversial, about physician aid in dying in diseases like dementia, whether it be done earlier on in the disease or potentially euthanasia when they no longer have capacity.
Yep. I'm glad you're dialing it up. I mean, because it is what people really are beginning to think about now that we have sort of had it out there for the terminal diseases. That's what all the laws address. What about the neurodegenerative disorders? And, the dementia for sure, but also the ALS, also the Parkinson's, also MS, and so on, which by and large are not covered by the existing laws that we have. And I didn't expect, you're right, a lot of this book is focused on that, or has that sort of as a subtext, and I didn't think it was going to. And of course, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm supposed to be self-aware. But what I didn't appreciate until after I'd done a lot of the writing is my own father had a dementing illness for the last half dozen years of his life, during which time he didn't speak. He was aphasic. But, he went the full route with the incontinence and with everything else that comes with a really bad dementia. And that fate is truly, for me and for many people, if not most people, a fate worse than death. And I realize that it is certainly much more terrifying to me than having some horrible disease. And glioblastoma has also been in my family, and it comes to mind. But it's more, it's much more terrifying. So I'm glad we're going to talk about that. And I would open this up to also say that in Canada, where they have if you will, universal laws that have been passed. I mean, they're modified according to each of the provinces, but there was a Supreme Court ruling, unlike ours, which said this is a basic human right. And there's some interesting differences what they came up with in terms of the protocols versus the United States. But bottom line is that they are now re-examining their medical assistance in dying laws, and very likely within the next year will come up with some provisions that will make these protocols flexible for folk who have dementias. And I'm talking about probably early dementias, certainly not severe the end-stage dementias.
Lew, I want to pick up on something you said a moment ago when you were talking about your father and talking about how being in a state of dementia is a state that seems worse than death. And I want to challenge that assumption, and also this sort of assumption that people who are living with disability, cognitive impairment, dementia, are necessarily have a poor quality of life. And I think the argument runs something thus, and John Kelly, who you interviewed for this book, articulated this well. I watched a YouTube video of him right before starting this podcast, where he says, every time I see a movie about somebody who looks like me, somebody who's disabled in a wheelchair, I get ready for some, happy story about, he's going to, nobly request physician aid in dying, $1 million baby, the sea within, and other such books or movies. And so that we're constantly, and I was also reminded of that scene in Super Size Me. Remember that one about the guy who ate like McDonald's for 1 month, but nothing but McDonald's? And he like interviews these advertising or people who monitor advertising, who described that, we are bombarded throughout our lives with imaging of fast food. And in the same way, we are bombarded in public media, in movies, in books, with images of disability as a life that's not worth living. And yet there's considerable research that supports the notion that quality of life can be good or even better in some states of disability with adequate support, And so I worry that the argument is based on this autonomy. Why shouldn't I get to choose this? When in fact, we don't understand the degree to which we are not actually setting the terms and conditions around that decision, which is highly influenced by media, by our cultural attitudes, etc.
Yeah, it's looking at this subject from the perspective of people like John Kelly, from folk who are dealing with disabilities, was like dementia, one of those topics that I didn't think was going to be as important to me when I started writing this as it proved to be. I think that activists like John have things that we do need to listen to, and that it certainly has pulled me back from, jumping to simple conclusions or making declarative statements. And I hope that you didn't hear me saying that quality of life of folk with dementia is terrible. What I said is essentially that I am terrified at the thought of getting a dementia myself, and it's based on what I saw with my father. The other thing, I guess, about dementia for me, and this was, again, unexpected. In the book, I, as you know, tell the story of a young woman who comes down with an early form presenile dementia, and who had always declared that if she had a dementia, she wanted to end her life. And in fact, her story is one in which the family, although they were completely in agreement with her about this, and her husband, who was a physician, was again in agreement, and they were going to make the most of their lives while they could. The nature of dementia, and particularly her dementia, was because nobody actually made a move, made a decision, set some sort of a hallmark for when something has to be done. Time slipped by, and the next thing you knew, she had slipped into her dementia further and was no longer able to speak up for herself, or for that matter, recognize the people around her, or do much more than what we did to begin this podcast, which is to say, sing along with some music that was meaningful to her. She was she was sent to a facility where she received excellent care. And, was she happy? Probably. But if her earlier self had been able to look down at what kind of life she was now leading, would that earlier self be happy, tortured, whatever? Probably. Yeah. Or
not. Or, wow, I didn't realize how well I could adapt, that I could still enjoy listening to music and sing along. But wow, that's actually a surprisingly good quality of life.
But does it matter what the earlier self thinks versus the current self? Like Eric Wadera when he's 18, probably looking at Eric Wadera when he's, how old am I now? Like 44? I lose track of my age. Like, oh my God, I never want to be that guy when I was 18. But here I am, and I'm pretty happy. Does it matter what my 18-year-old thought? I am a different person now, just like that individual with dementia is a different person. Doesn't matter what the previous person thought.
and it may not, although some folk feel rather strongly that they want as much consistency, I guess, as they can in their lives. If they had been in control and successful in being in control through much of their life, they want to continue that. If they were big readers, they can't and don't want to foresee a life where they no longer can read. If their families are important to them and they no longer can recognize families, if food was important to them and they no longer quite remember how to swallow, again, it's a toughie. It is a real toughie. I just know for myself, I'm going through changes like Eric has. The new Lew has become a grandfather about a year ago for the first time and has another daughter-in-law who's pregnant. I found that I spent a week with my wife taking care of that first grandchild. I didn't write. I didn't do much of anything other than sort of read stories that this little baby didn't understand, fed her, changed her. And I was, I was quite content with that. So, I can sort of feel, I've lived in this summer, the experience of, potentially a new me, and it's okay.
Mm-hmm. Jules wants to jump in here. Jules?
I think this points to one of the nuances of advanced directives and how it's important that they can change over time. You guys did a podcast earlier about dementia-specific advanced care planning and directives. And I think the fact that how we'll feel in the future may be different, and the fact that it's hard to predict. It doesn't take away the importance of thinking about it, but it relies on the importance of being flexible.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge I have, even with advanced care planning, is this concept of adaptability. As a human species, we are incredibly adaptable. While we think we aren't, while we think our quality of life will be miserable, let's say if we have a disability or an amputation, when we do have those issues, we actually tend to have a good quality of life. Alex wrote a great paper looking at nursing home eligible patients as part of a PACE program for all-inclusive care of the elderly. These people are pretty disabled, and they had a good quality of life. Mm-hmm. Yes. And that's because we are adaptable as a species.
Totally right. Totally right. And so my own, sort of assumption as I think forward as to what Canada, for example, is going to do. Jules is on the mark. They're going to rely more on advanced directives geared to sort of tackle the dementia question. They're going to deal with advanced directives that say, if I no longer am able to eat by myself, I don't want a tube placed down and the like. Where I think these things are going to become applicable is, again, not to the severe demented, not to even the probably medium, if you will, stage, but to the folk who are still in the early but very distinct stages of dementia, where they are going to still be uncomfortable. They're going to be suffering because they have dementia. They haven't adapted to it. And they're going, excuse me, to be able to pull out these advanced directives as support for why they, at that point, should still be eligible. Why they should be eligible for these laws.
All right. My last question for you, because I realize we've taken up a lot of your time, is that so as we start encompassing broader groups of individuals who aren't at the end of life, I can imagine those groups of individuals that you've talked to around this who are opposed to this could say, see, I told you so. Like, this was a red herring, this less than 6 months to live. Like, where does the slippery slope end? Does everybody have a right to end their lives at any time? Should this apply to people with debilitating psychiatric diseases who say, I'm suffering, I don't want to suffer anymore, end my life? Is there a limit? Is there nothing past this boundary? And I recognize I already know the answer. It's probably like there is a lot of controversy, and I think that the reason that we've had multiple podcasts on this is incredibly interesting, fascinating, and conflictual kind of topic. But what are your thoughts? Is there this is where the line is?
Slippery slope has once again reared its head.
I had to throw that in there.
And I was tempted, I didn't, but I'm tempted still to write an op-ed called Traversing the Slippery Slope, which would make the point that in the old days, as in 25 years ago, maybe, we thought of an icy, slippery slope as being the sort of thing that can only harm us, and we should stay off of it and stay indoors and make sure we have our mufflers on if we go outside. Nowadays, people put on gear and they call it skiing as they traverse the slippery slope and enjoy themselves.
Yeah, on the West Coast compared to the East Coast, we have something called fluffy snow. So it's not as slippery.
But bottom line is that, yes, those folk who are going to say, isn't this a slippery slope when you're talking about extending these laws, changing, modifying these laws now, laws need to get modified and changed. When the Emancipation Proclamation was declared and slavery was abolished, that still left a lot of room for modification and laws, and we're still making laws so that people can vote, so that people won't get excluded from voting rolls. When that Emancipation Proclamation was declared, no one would have ever contemplated that we could legalize miscegenation, marriage between people of different races or ethnicities. It takes time, and it is a good thing when laws begin to reflect what we in our societies need.
Great. There are so many topics we could touch on. We haven't talked about medications. We haven't talked about new tech, helium-based means of ending somebody's life. We haven't talked about so many aspects. But I think, my summary is this is an incredibly thoughtful treatment of a very complex topic. And Lew, kudos to you for putting the hard work into interviewing all of these different people about their stories and thoughtfully reflecting. And you talk in this book about you don't hide your own opinions and your own perspectives, your own stance here. And in fact, you say, my personal hope is that this book will serve to encourage us to talk further about broadening inclusion measures and cautiously liberalizing future laws.
Yeah.
And that it, with eyes wide open, people should read this book because it presents a compelling case about issues that are sort of at the forefront and that will continue to be pressing around this issue going forward.
And I really liked how it was not, because whenever I see a book like this, I worry, it's just going to be unilateral, one-sided, we should be
polemic.
Doing this. And that I had that worry when I started your book,
Me too.
and it quickly disappeared. I loved how you brought in the viewpoints of the disability rights advocates, how you actually saw their viewpoint and the real truth to their argument too, and how this is a challenging topic that it's important to see both sides. So I really want to thank you for that too.
Hey guys, I truly enjoyed this. I know that people will never hear "You Are My Sunshine" quite the same way as a result of your singing.
Well, how about we actually end with a little bit more of "You Are My Sunshine," Alex?
Okay, so the next verse, most people don't sing the next verse.
Uh-oh.
But we'll sing the next verse because it's a little bit, it gets a little bit different perspective on the song. But we'll start off with the chorus again. Here, I'm going to hit this button here. You're going to join in the chorus, right? All right.
Sure.
You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when the skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. I'll always love you and make you happy if you will only say the same. But if you leave me to love another, you'll regret it. Oh, someday. Yeah, you are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away.
Oh my God, that is dark. It reminds me. Did you ever see Hamilton?
Yeah.
The King's song in Hamilton, where it's this love song.
Sending you a battalion of battalion.
When push
to
comes to
remind
shove,
you
I
of my
will
love.
kill your friends and family to remind you of my love.
Right.
It got dark real fast.
That's right.
Well, Lew, thank you
Thank
very
you, Lew.
much for joining us.
Appreciate it.
And
Hey, guys.
I want to thank all of our listeners. If you enjoy our Jerry Pal podcast, please remember to rate us on iTunes or whatever podcasting app. Also, retweet and share our posts. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. What makes us continue is having people share our podcast with others. We look forward to having you with us next week.
Thanks, folks. Bye.